Before I delve into the topic of today's video, I just want to note that this video will be released just after the 3rd anniversary of my channel, and I just want to say I'm so thankful to all of you that have supported me throughout my time here on YouTube. I seriously appreciate you all so much. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel as well, as we're getting really close to 100,000 subscribers, and I'd really appreciate it if you did. Anyways, shameless subscribe to the channel plug aside. When I first began my regular video making and research process, I originally didn't intend to even mention the channel's anniversary, since I didn't have a particularly special video topic in mind that I could reasonably release in my usual week or so time frame. Or so I thought. However, while I was researching information for the topic I originally intended for this video, I accidentally stumbled across one of the most unbelievably bizarre and controversial findings I've ever come across in my research for any of the videos I've made for the channel, which ended up completely shifting the topic of this video in the process. So, I suppose it's only fitting that this video I release just after the anniversary of the channel is indeed special, in the sense that it will be a little different than the majority of my videos, so be sure to stick around until the end. Makalu is the 5th highest peak on the planet, standing at a height of 8,485 meters at its summit. As one of the 14 8,000 meters or higher peaks on the planet, otherwise known as 8,000ers, Makalu is a relatively popular peak for high-altitude mountaineers to attempt to ascend, and a peak I've covered in several previous videos here on the channel. Now, for the sake of brevity, if you're not familiar with the peak's background or the conditions climbers must endure while on its slopes, I highly suggest you check out one of those videos for more background information, as well as a general explanation of the peak's relative difficulty, as I won't be delving into much greater detail about Makalu here in this video. However, before we get into the specifics of the incidents I'll be detailing in this video, I do need to introduce another concept that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but is also sometimes misrepresented to those who aren't familiar with it, which is the concept of large group charter expeditions. These types of expedition teams are usually seen on more popular peaks such as the 8,000ers and work a bit differently than a more traditional style expedition team, where everyone on the team is working together to accomplish their shared goal of reaching the summit. These large chartered group expedition teams instead appeal to less experienced or organized small groups of climbers, as well as solo climbers, as the greater expedition team is responsible for providing logistical support such as fixing ropes for use by the greater team and establishing the fixed camps along the route, as well as providing guides if also requested. But this style of expedition team also offers flexibility to the clients to essentially ascend the peak however they'd like, as one can climb the peak solo, but with the convenience of ascending the peak with the support provided by a team, such as with the aforementioned fixing of ropes and establishing of the camps along the route. However, these types of expedition teams also often draw a lot of criticism whenever a solo climber that is a member of the greater expedition team perishes, with the most famous example of this being the tragic death of David Sharp on Mount Everest, as many of these pointed criticisms are often levied at the greater expedition team for not providing them with more support, without the understanding that many of them specifically join these expedition teams to climb solo and generally expect to be left alone while on the mountain. In fact, today's video features several such climbers, with one expedition team in specific, the Greater Seven Summits Makalu Expedition Team of 2019, suffering the loss of several climbers in separate incidents during the 2019 spring climbing season. On May 7th, 2019, a member of the Greater Seven Summits Makalu expedition team and one of Peru's most celebrated mountaineers, a 52-year-old man named Richard Leopoldo Hidalgo Yara, was attempting to ascend Makalu on his own and without the use of supplemental oxygen. That morning, Richard would opt to accompany a group of Sherpas ascending to the team's Camp 2, located at an elevation of 6,620 meters, as the Sherpas were tasked with fixing a section of rope just beyond Camp 2, and Richard was eager to jump on the opportunity for some company during his first ascent up to Camp 2. Upon their arrival at Camp 2 later that evening, Richard would set up his tent and then would subsequently enjoy a meal with the Sherpas before they part ways for the night as they retreated into their respective separate tents. The following morning, on May 8th, the Sherpas would depart from Camp 2 to carry out their aforementioned rope fixing obligations, and upon returning to Camp 2 later that day, they would note that the camp lay completely undisturbed throughout the entirety of the duration of their absence, as Richard had seemingly never emerged from his tent. After calling out for him a few times outside his tent and receiving no response in return, the Sherpas would enter his tent to check on him. Inside, they found Richard wrapped within his sleeping bag, cold and lifeless, and the Sherpas would state that they believed Richard had died sometime during the night after they had parted ways at 9 p.m. the preceding evening. Richard's cause of death was listed as the likely result of suffering severe symptoms of acute altitude sickness, although in which way these symptoms exactly manifested remains a mystery, as a more exact cause of death was never ultimately determined. The following two fatalities on Makalu in May of 2019 would both take place on May 16, 2019, which would similarly serve as summit day for both victims as well. The victim of the first fatality on the 16th that I'll detail in this video was another member of the Greater Seven Summits expedition team, who, much like Richard, was attempting to ascend the peak alone. A 52-year-old highly accomplished Indian mountaineer named Dipankar Ghosh. After departing from the team's high camp that morning, Mr. Ghosh would make his way to Makalu's summit successfully, where he'd taken his accomplishment for a short while before beginning his descent from the summit alone. Seemingly exhausted from the effort he'd expended to reach the summit, Mr. Ghosh would slowly plod his way back down the upper slopes of Makalu, lagging behind the other climbers who had also made their summit bids that day. As the sun began to dip beneath the western horizon, Mr. Ghosh would make brief radio contact with the team back at base camp, informing them that he was moving slowly and still at least several hundred meters away from high camp. However, following this brief update at around 7 p.m. that evening, the team at base camp was unable to re-establish radio contact with Mr. Ghosh. Following this call, after the sun had fully set, Mr. Ghosh had still not returned to high camp, and some of the other members of the Greater Seven Summits expedition team would scan the uppermost slopes in an effort to try and spot him. And indeed, one member of the team, a Mexican woman named Eva Martinez, would spot what appeared to be Mr. Ghosh within the traverse located approximately 300 meters above high camp, where he appeared to be signaling for assistance by flashing the light on and off on his headlamp. After reporting her sighting to the Seven Summits expedition team's guides, an attempt to form a rescue team of Sherpas would ultimately fail to come to fruition, as the Sherpas would refuse to search for him, asserting that they were too exhausted from assisting other clients ascending and descending from the summit that day, and so Mr. Ghosh was left to fend for himself high on Makalu's slopes. Unfortunately, Mr. Ghosh wouldn't survive the extreme conditions of the nighttime within the death zone and would die from exposure sometime over the course of the night. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the second and third deaths on Makalu would take place during the same evening on May 16th, 2019. And although I detailed the circumstances of Mr. Ghosh's death second in this video, it's ultimately unknown whether Mr. Ghosh or this next victim actually perished first, which is a particular detail to note for later. In fact, I'd highly recommend that you take mental note of as many details of the next victim's death as you can, as researching this next death is ultimately what led me to shift the premise of this video entirely. On May 16th, 2019, 16 of the 18 members of an Indian Army expedition team would attempt to make their final push for the summit from their high camp, ascending towards the summit alongside, although apart from, the other climbers from the 7 Summits expedition team, including Mr. Ghosh, who were likewise making their own pushes for the summit that day, as the Indian Army expedition team was following a slightly different route to the summit. In the early afternoon, all 16 members of the Indian Army expedition team that had set off for the summit that morning would successfully reach Makalu's summit, and after celebrating their accomplishment for a while at the summit, the team members began to descend back towards their high camp. However, during the descent, as the group had reached an elevation of approximately 8,200 meters, one of the team's members, a 35-year-old man named Narayan Singh, would suddenly become stricken with severe symptoms of altitude sickness, which would cause him to become incapacitated as he was unable to descend any further on his own. After the other members of the summit team briefly deliberated over what to do in the situation, they collectively decided that Mr. Singh's condition would likely prove fatal before they would be able to carry him back to the safety of a camp at a significantly lower elevation, and additionally they were all too exhausted from their summit bid that day to carry him along with them, and so they would ultimately leave Mr. Singh where he lay at an elevation of 8,200 meters as they made their way back to their high camp without him. The remaining members of the summit team seemingly knew that there was no chance that Mr. Singh would manage to recover enough to haul himself back to camp, nor would he survive the night, noting in their expedition log that evening, quote, "Narayan Singh died at 8,200 meters on May 16th, descending from the summit because of altitude issues. Sherpas will try to bring his body down soon," the day's log entry reads. Mr. Singh's tragic death, along with Mr. Ghosh's, would mark the second and third deaths on Makalu in May of 2019. However, they unfortunately wouldn't be the last. This also will not be the last of Mr. Singh's death I'll be detailing in this video, as there's actually so much more here left to unpack, although for the sake of the structure of this video, let's first move on to the final fatality on Makalu in May of 2019 before I go deeper into that. In the days following both men's deaths, their remains were swiftly located, and Indian diplomats at the Indian Embassy in Nepal would set to work lobbying their local contacts to organize a recovery party consisting of local Sherpa climbers to retrieve both the remains of Mr. Ghosh as well as the remains of Mr. Singh and haul them back to high camp before they could be further transported down the mountainside for proper burial. This rather complex process would consume the next 5 days until a team of 15 highly skilled Nepali climbers would arrive at Makalu on May 21st to begin their recovery efforts. However, not long after their arrival at the peak, Makalu would become cloaked in storms as the rescue team slowly made their way through the frigid, blizzard-like conditions on its slopes, where the stormy conditions would interfere with the team's ability to contact base camp, and thus their progress towards their goal would remain largely unknown to the outside world as well. With the storm still raging on Makalu's slopes, The rescue team were primed to attempt to enact their plan to recover the bodies of the 2 stricken climbers from the mountainside and haul them back to high camp. However, one of the team's members, a man named Tenji Sherpa, had fallen ill during this ascent. However, fortunately, another member of the Greater Seven Summits expedition team, who had made her own summit push in the days following Mr. Singh and Mr. Ghosh's deaths, just so happened to be a doctor and at the same camp, and so she was asked to take a look at the stricken man to assess his condition. She would recognize Tenji's symptoms as high-altitude pulmonary edema, which is one of the commonly suffered and potentially fatal side effects of altitude sickness, and furthermore, the man's internal body temperature was alarmingly low. The doctor would suggest that Tenji be given the medication nifedipine to help with his condition in the short term. However, the other members of the recovery team refused to give him any further medications. Furthermore, the doctor would insist that Tenji should be escorted to a lower elevation immediately, and after she continued to insist, the rest of the recovery team assured her that they would help him descend as soon as possible with support. The doctor would then depart from the camp to begin her own descent back to base camp. However, not long after she departed, the remaining members of the recovery team would not assist Tenji to a lower elevation as they had implied they would, and instead set off towards the summit to resume the recovery efforts. Later that evening, the remaining members of the recovery team would successfully manage to haul the remains of both deceased climbers from higher up on the mountain back to their camp. However, as they returned to camp, they would soon realize that there was now a third body that required removal from the mountainside, as Tenji had perished sometime during their absence spent recovering the remains of Mr. Ghosh and Mr. Singh. Now, this is normally where I'd end the video, but as I mentioned earlier, this is where this video will begin to become a bit different than most of my content as we loop back to the third death, the tragic death of Narayan Singh. Now, the account of facts surrounding his tragic death that I've presented earlier in this video is, as is standard when I make my videos, compiled from a range of different news articles, both from when the events were still unfolding and after the entire ordeal had come to a conclusion, along with verifying their ascents, expedition teams, and the expedition team's members, with records from the Himalayan database, which is the most comprehensive and accurate record keeper of Himalayan mountaineering information currently in existence. I say all this because, while I was researching specifically the details surrounding Narayan Singh's death, I came across something I've never encountered thus far while researching information for my, as of the time of making this video, nearly 150 videos here on the channel. A metaphorical piece of the puzzle that just didn't and couldn't fit with any of the other pieces. An alternate and verifiably false account of the events surrounding Narayan Singh's death, astonishingly published by a reputable mainstream outdoor-specific publication, Outside Magazine. Now, I'll delve into the nitty-gritty details of my findings and the specifics of why this account is verifiably false here in just a bit, but first, allow me to read you, in full, this alternate false narrative surrounding Narayan Singh's death in its entirety as it appears in an article published by Outside Magazine in May of this year, 2024, with its writing credits attributed to 2 individuals named Ben Ayers and Tulsi Raniyar. The article reads, quote, "In 2019, a Nepali mountaineer and rescue specialist named Gesman Tamang led a team of 6 onto 27,838-foot Makalu to recover the body of a climber who had died in the so-called death zone above 26,000 feet. A Nepali soldier named Narayan Singh showed signs of altitude sickness. Tamang encouraged Singh to rest at Camp 3 at around 24,600 feet and to then descend to safety. The team continued climbing until they located the body near the French col at around 27,000 feet. It took them more than 24 hours to free the body from the mountain, secure it to a sled, and move it down to Camp 3. As they entered camp, they found Singh in a tent, barely breathing. We tried to give him oxygen and save his life, but we couldn't, Tamang told Outside. Singh died a short time later. The group had no choice but to leave him on the mountain in order to complete their original mission of bringing down the other body. They arranged Singh's body alongside fixed ropes so that other crews could bring him down. Once I reached base camp, I couldn't go back up for my friend, Tamang said. It was too painful. My heart wouldn't allow it. Another team eventually retrieved Singh's remains from the mountain, the article reads. Now, if you compare the details of this story with the one that I detailed earlier in this video, or literally any other source that reported information about his death, this account is undeniably completely different, and upon closer inspection, the finer details included in Mr. Tamang's account of Mr. Singh's death simply don't add up whatsoever, as I'll explain. I think the easiest place to start this breakdown, however, is by analyzing the few details of both accounts that do line up, which is that Narayan Singh, who was a soldier, would perish as a result of severe symptoms of altitude sickness while on Makalu slopes in 2019, which, admittedly, isn't very many similarities. But this at least establishes that this Narayan Singh is indeed the same individual across both accounts. Now let's take a closer look at the details of his story in further depth and the cracks that begin to emerge, even with such basic information as Mr. Singh's background and nationality, as the article states that he was a Nepali soldier, while all records show that he was in fact an Indian soldier and national, and was on the roster of the Indian Army expedition team to Makalu in 2019, and not a member of a 6-person body recovery team. Additionally, the article states that he never ascended past Camp 3, which is also verifiably false, as records confirm that he did in fact reach the summit successfully. However, one of the most damning and glaring holes in his story becomes apparent when inquiring about one major unspecified detail in his account. Who exactly, or even possibly, was this unnamed deceased climber that they were supposedly removing from the mountainside? The first death on Makalu in 2019 was the death of Richard Leopoldo Hidalgo Yara, which I detailed earlier in this video, which if you recall took place at Camp 2, which is located at an elevation well beneath the death zone. Well, if not Richard, then perhaps it was a climber from a previous season, you might retort. However, of course, I decided to look into the details of all the deaths on Makalu in the years preceding 2019, and the results of my query were quite telling. The 4 deaths previous to Richard's also took place well below the death zone, as Ong Darwa Sherpa, Lokpa Ongyal Sherpa, Datenji Sherpa, and Yannick Claude Sylvain Gognere would all perish at elevations well below the death zone as well, meaning that the last death before Mr. Singh and Mr. Ghosh's deaths in the death zone on Makalu would take place all the way back in 2013, when Chinese climber Lu Zhongyang fell to his death while descending from the summit. The chances that Lu's remains were still near the summit and exposed rather than buried by over half a decade's worth of snowfall and avalanches are near zero, and it seems equally unlikely that suddenly there was a need to remove his body from so high up on the mountain after so many years had passed. Furthermore, the details provided by Mr. Tamang's account of the recovery seemingly alludes to where Mr. Ghosh's remains were found. However, this makes no sense for a number of reasons. First off being Mr. Ghosh died on the same day as Mr. Singh, and so if they were sent to retrieve his body, he would have had to have already been dead when the team arrived. And as he further stated that his recovery team would spend over 24 hours recovering the body to return to Camp 3 to find Mr. Singh still alive but barely breathing, then dying shortly after, also just doesn't line up at all. I didn't just stop there though. I decided to check all the records of expeditions on Makalu in 2019 for an expedition team that fit his description, being 6 members in size, which surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, I found no records of any such party on Makalu in 2019. Additionally, I found no evidence of Gesmund Tamong being a member of any expedition team on Makalu in 2019, or any evidence of his involvement with any body recovery operations, including as a member of the 15-person Nepali body recovery team that recovered the bodies of Mr. Singh and Mr. Ghosh. In fact, his name is the only name of all the names in this story that isn't verified through record keeping to have been on Makalu in 2019. Thus, with these points clearly established, unfortunately, there is little other conclusion left to draw other than Mr. Tamong's account was indeed, for whatever reason, completely fabricated. However damning these findings may be, however, I still decided that it was only fair to reach out to Mr. Tamong directly with my findings in an effort to seek clarification surrounding his story and the number of issues I'd found with it. Despite allowing him more than 3 days to respond to my queries, as of the time of making this video, he is still yet to respond and thus could not be reached for comment. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, I didn't originally set out with the intention of exposing a false narrative made by a fellow YouTuber with a channel nearly twice the size of mine, nor a major publication of outdoors-related journalism, and to be frank, I debated whether I should just scrap this video entirely a number of times, as I'm simply baffled as to why or how such a narrative was even contrived and then subsequently published in the first place, especially given that Mr. Tamong already had established a reputation within the mountaineering community as a well-respected climber. So it just makes me scratch my head as to why he'd attempt to apparently just blatantly lie about something so easily debunked upon closer inspection, which makes my cynical side reason that perhaps he did so simply because he thought that nobody would bother looking into it any further than the article. I mean, it is why so many people parrot blatantly incorrect information like, Annapurna is the deadliest mountain in the world, which I used as a bit in a previous video, but apparently even writers and editors at a reputable major outdoor magazine publication such as Outside Magazine can't seemingly be bothered to actually put in the legwork and effort required to verify such claims, or even just get his nationality right. However, Mr. Tamong clearly didn't account for the fact that I, Morbid Midnight, always do go the extra mile when doing my research, and I would piece together that he'd lied. Ultimately, the reason that I did decide to go through with making this video is because at the end of the day, while Mr. Tamong's false narrative, even when viewed in the most generous light, which is that he benignly invented his account to stress the risks to the members of teams recovering the remains of climbers within the Himalayas, still falls flat. This alternative false narrative truly doesn't serve the purpose as well as the true series of events that actually transpired on Makalu in May of 2019, as the story of their deaths serves this purpose far better overall. And while Mr. Singh himself didn't perish while attempting to remove a climber's body from Makalu's slopes, unfortunately, Nima Tenji Sherpa actually did, while attempting to recover Mr. Singh and Mr. Ghosh's remains from Makalu, and this alternative, entirely constructed narrative only serves to undermine the sacrifice he ultimately made that fateful May in 2019. Thank you all for watching.